Hello BookTube. Today I'm talking about Steal This Book by Abbie Hoffman. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know that I've recently returned to the US after many years of living in Asia. During the time I was living in Asia, I was limited in what books I could find to whatever books were sold at the local bookstores in Asia, which was a very limited selection, or what I happened to find at a used bookstore at Backpacker Street or something like that. But now that I'm back in the US, through interlibrary alone, I find that I could get a hold of just about any book I want to. Interlibrary loan in the US is really something, isn't it? So one of the things I've been trying to do on this channel, now that I'm finally back in the US, is track down some of the books that were influential in my youth that I read maybe 30 years ago and haven't read since then, and just talk about some of the books that influenced me when I was younger. And Steal This Book was definitely one of those. But let's start at the beginning. Who was Abbie Hoffman? So Abbie Hoffman was a leader of the hippie movement in the 1960s. He was one of the co-founders of the Yippie Party, which was an attempt to blend the hippie counterculture movement with the political movement in the 1960s. He was famous for a few things. He led a protest against the Pentagon in 1967. He was one of the Chicago 8, meaning one of 8 defendants who were brought on trial for allegedly staging a riot at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, and for Steal This Book. According to Wikipedia, Peter Coyote, who was one of Abbie Hoffman's associates, said that most of the people in the hippie movement were trying to do things anonymously. They did it for nothing, as nothing, everything was anonymous and for the cause. But he said Abbie Hoffman was, here's a picture, Abbie Hoffman was trying to set himself up as the leader of the hippie movement. And perhaps that's a good description. He was trying to set himself up as the leader of the movement. He was very much into political theater. He was funny. He used a lot of quips. The media loved him back in his day. The cameras would follow him around everywhere. He was on TV a lot. He was a famous figure in the 1960s. Steal This Book was written, or at least published, in 1971. The publishers, many of the publishers objected to the title, as you can imagine. I was listening to one podcast, I haven't been able to verify this, but in a previous book that Abbie Hoffman wrote, apparently, Woodstock Nation, apparently in the first printing of it, Abbie Hoffman said, "Steal this book." He wanted that printed on the title. And consequently, some people did steal the book from the bookstores. So in subsequent reprintings, the publisher removed Steal This Book from Woodstock Nation. So for his next book, Abbie Hoffman decided to make Steal This Book the title, meaning if the Steal This Book is the title of the book, then you can't possibly censor it. And the idea being that Abbie Hoffman was encouraging his followers not to pay money to the bookstores and the publishing companies, etc., but to just rip off this book, to steal it from the bookstores. And apparently a number of these books were stolen back in the day. According to Wikipedia, nobody really knows how many copies were stolen, but apparently a lot of them. I didn't actually steal this book. I got it through interlibrary loan, but I was carrying it around with me the past couple of weeks while I was reading it. And I have to confess, I was a little bit nervous about leaving this book around when I was taking it into work, leaving it on lunch breaks. I've been doing a lot of substitute teaching and temporary work, so I've been going into unknown environments. And I could just picture somebody seeing this book in my bag and just taking it because it says steal this book, particularly when I'm at a middle school or a high school. Fortunately, nobody stole it. You can see I still have this, but I could just picture myself going back to the library and saying, one of the books I had checked out was stolen from me. And the librarian would say, oh, that's too bad. You'll have to pay the fine to replace it. What was the title of the book? And I'd have to say, you're not going to believe this. The title was Steal This Book. I mean, that didn't actually happen to me, but that dialogue was running through my head while I was carrying this book around with me. Anyways, Abbie Hoffman had published a few books before this. I mentioned Woodstock Nation already and a few others. But Steal This Book was by far his most famous, and it was a huge bestseller. And this is what he's remembered for today, for better or for worse. I'm going to talk about the book's politics in a bit and maybe distance myself from some of it. But Abbie Hoffman, it's a well-remembered book. And in fact, you can see here, this is the 50th anniversary edition now. So it's a historic book that's gone through a lot of reprintings and is one of those books that is worth reading just because it's part of American culture, whether you agree with it or not. Now, let me talk about my history with this book briefly. This book, by the time I read it when I was 18, it was already 25 years old at this point. So it was already kind of a historical relic when I read it 25 years ago. I became interested in the 1960s and the counterculture movement when I was about 17 or 18, which is the right age to get interested in that kind of stuff. In addition, I'd always been interested in history, and this was recent history. People say that you're always most fascinated by the era of history that happened 5 or 10 years before you were born, because it's got that combination of being familiar and yet distant. It's not in the history books. You don't get taught it at school, but it's in the culture. You pick up references to it everywhere. And I don't know if that's true for everyone, but that was definitely true for me. When I was a teenager, I would pick up references to Abbie Hoffman in various places. I think the first place I remember hearing Abbie Hoffman's name was the John Lennon song, Give Peace a Chance, where at the end of the song, John Lennon just name drops a bunch of people from the counterculture movement. Abbie Hoffman's one of the people he name drops. I had the CD. I was going through the liner notes and looking at the lyrics. I didn't know who any of these people were. So I asked my mom, and she explained to me who everybody was, and I remember her explaining who Abbie Hoffman was. Excuse me. The next place I remember hearing his name, it was 1996, the year I was 18. And the Democrats had their convention in Chicago for the first time since 1968. So 1996 was the first time that there was a Democratic convention in Chicago since the infamous 1968 one. And there was a few references to Abbie Hoffman in the news at that time. He was dead by that time. He had committed suicide in 1989. But there were a couple of brief articles about his son, etc. So I was picking up these references to Abbie Hoffman, and this was before the internet, or at least before the internet as we know it today. There was no Wikipedia where you could just type the name in and get all the information. But the little bits and pieces that I did find intrigued me. At that time, I was also becoming infatuated with leftist politics. I had grown up in a conservative Christian environment, but for various reasons was making a political conversion at that time and was hungry for leftist literature or counterculture literature. Now, I'm not going to get all into my political transformation. That's a different topic for another time. But I did find this book in the library. And I was actually going to a conservative Christian school at the time, Calvin College. But they had this book in their library. And like I said earlier, this is agree or disagree. This is a piece of Americana, American history. And I absolutely ate it up at the time to a degree which is embarrassing now, looking back on it. And the thing that I'm most embarrassed about, if I'm making confessions, is that it's emphasized repeatedly in this book that it's okay to steal if you're doing it from corporations. Because, you know, the whole point of this book is stick it to the man. So I completely took this on board. And I thought at the time that if you could go into a store and you could shoplift something and get away with it, then that was good, because you know you don't want to support the store. That's just supporting capitalism and the establishment. And that again, that's a point Abbie Hoffman mentions repeatedly in this book. So I never shoplifted anything big. Stuff $3 or less, if memory serves. The most common thing I would do is I'd be grocery shopping in a supermarket, one of those big chains, and I would be eating some of the food while I was shopping. So you know, I would pick up an apple and I would eat the apple while I was shopping. And if anyone confronted me about it, I'd say, "Oh, I plan on paying for this later." But if I could finish the apple and nobody confronted me about it, then I would just quietly throw the apple away, and then I had successfully eaten an apple and not stolen for it. Or, I had eaten an apple and not paid for it. And I felt proud of myself. Or I'd do the same thing with a candy bar, maybe eat it in the store, kind of quietly dispose of the wrapper, that kind of thing. I think once or twice I might have snuck something out in my pocket. The memory gets a little bit hazy after all these years. But a point being, I became a petty shoplifter when I thought I could get away with it because of this book. Although in my defense, I did not go through that phase for long, because even at that stage, I started to think to myself, this isn't really right. Not because at the time I felt any sympathy for the big corporations, but because there was an element of it which was dishonest. So, for example, like I said with the apple, if anyone confronted me about the apple, I'd say, no, I'm going to pay for this later. Or, you know, if I had something in my pocket and somebody asked me about it, I'd say, oh, no, there's nothing in my pocket, etc. So there was lying involved. And I came to the conclusion, or the realization, that dishonesty had no part of a legitimate political movement. Because if you embrace dishonesty, then you don't have a legitimate political movement, right? And that's something that Abbie Hoffman does not make the connection with in this book. So he talks about shoplifting in this book. It's a big theme of this book. At one point, you know, he says, if you're confronted, just lie your ass off. Or lie like a motherfucker or something like that. There's a fair amount of profanity in this book. And you think to yourself, well, okay, but what kind of movement is that building where you tell people to lie all the time? And then when you tell them that the war in Vietnam is wrong and that it's propping up illegitimate regime and it's killing lots of innocent civilians, why would they believe you when your whole movement is built on lies and which you've established that you're going to lie all the time? The Vietnam War is long gone now, but whatever the political cause is of the time, if you've destroyed your credibility because you lie like a motherfucker to shoplift, then why would anyone believe you on any other political cause? So as these things evolved in my mind at the time, first of all, I had this system where I thought, okay, you can try to steal, but if somebody confronts you on it and says, is there something in your pocket? Then you are morally obliged to say yes and just take the consequences. But if you can steal from a big corporation without having to open your mouth either way, then it's okay. And I believed that for half a year or something like that. But then I thought eventually, okay, the very act of trying to sneak something into your pocket is deceptive. Even though you're not lying with your mouth, you're lying with the sleight of hand. So that's dishonest in and of itself. Even at the time, the influence on me was relatively short-lived before I thought better of it. Certainly looking back on it now, that I'm much older and more conservative, I just think this whole book is terrible advice. Now, before I filmed this review, I did what I usually do, which is I read a couple other reviews, listened to a couple other reviews on BookTube or on YouTube. And most people seem to be remembering this book fondly, which surprises me, because after rereading it, I'm like, this book, it's written by an asshole who's giving asshole advice to other assholes. I mean, it's just a terrible book. But perhaps a lot of that anger is anger at myself from 25, 30 years ago, because I had been so infatuated with this ideology at one time that I feel that revulsion against it now. Like there's nothing like a convert or an ex-convert, as the saying goes. A lot of the other reviews you'll read about this book are something, or listen to the reviews you'll listen to about this book are along the lines of like, oh, Abbie, he was such a revolutionary, such a rebel. This book has such a rebellious spirit. Isn't it great? But yeah, my review is going to be like, oh, geez, what an asshole. I can't believe I like this guy. I can't believe I ever liked this guy as I'm reading this. And again, that's somewhat personal, that revulsion. Let me start maybe with a compliment. Let me go ahead and start with a compliment. At times, I think Abbie Hoffman has a very powerful style. And in fact, when I was 18 and I was still at this conservative Christian college, I was taking an English course, like a freshman writing course. And each Friday, the professor had us bring in a piece of writing that we really liked. And one Friday, I brought in a passage from Steal This Book and read it aloud to the class. Now, because this was a conservative Christian college, I censored it slightly. Anytime the word said fuck, I changed it to another word. But other than that, I pretty much read it just as it stood in the book. And somewhat to my surprise, the professor actually liked it. She said, that's very powerful, and there's a parallel style there which makes it sound really powerful. And this is right from the beginning of the book, the introduction. But I think, rereading it now, I think, this can sound really powerful. And there's a control of style here. Now, whether this is Abbie Hoffman or whether this is one of his co-writers, there's a couple people credited as co-writers here, which I think quite often when people are credited as co-writers, it often means that they ghost wrote a large portion of the book. I don't know if that's the case here, but okay. All right, just to mention that there were a couple other people involved in this book. I don't know if we should give all the credit to Abbie Hoffman, but let me read from that here. The introduction, and hopefully maybe demonstrate where the prose can be quite powerful. We cannot survive without learning to fight, and that is the lesson in the second section. Fight. Separate revolutionaries from outlaws. The purpose of part 2 is not to fuck the system, but destroy it. The weapons are carefully chosen. They are homemade in that they are designed for use in our unique electronic jungle. Here, the uptown reviewer will find ample proof of our violent nature. But again, the dictionary of laws fails us. Murder in a uniform is heroic. In a costume, it is a crime. False advertisements win awards. Forgers end up in jail. Inflated prices guarantee large profits, while shoplifters are punished. Politicians conspire to create police riots, and victims are convicted in the courts. Students are gunned down and then indicted by suburban grand juries as the troublemakers. A modern, highly mechanized army travels 9,000 miles to commit genocide against a small nation of great vision and then accuses its people of aggression. Slumlords allow rats to maim children and then complain of violence in the streets. Everything is topsy-turvy. If we internalize the language and imagery of the pigs, we will forever be fucked. And then let me jump down just a little bit more on the same page. Until we understand the nature of institutional violence and how it manipulates values and mores to maintain the power of the few, we will forever be imprisoned in the caves of ignorance. When we conclude that bank robbers, rather than bankers, should be trustees of the universities, then we begin to think clearly. When we see the Army Mathematics Research and Development Center and the Bank of America as cesspools of violence, filling the minds of young with hatred, turning one against another, then we begin to think revolutionary. So I liked that passage when I was 18, and I have to admit, I still appreciate the power of the prose now. But yeah, the rest of the book. So one thing I'll mention is once you get into this book, it's a lot of lists of places and a lot of instructions about how to do rather boring things, like how to sign up for Medicaid or Medicare, or how to get free food, or how to set up a radio station. And there's also a lot of lists of, can you see that here? Medical care, lists of places. And I was reading through it and I thought, this book is actually a lot more boring than I remember. And eventually, I realized that the book I was remembering was not the book I thought I remembered. So, the Abbie Hoffman book that I'm remembering was not Steal This Book. It was Woodstock Nation. Steal This Book, I must have just read the introduction and the beginning of it, and then I think I just bailed on the boring parts and didn't actually finish this book. So, I've already said I am over my youthful infatuation with Abbie Hoffman, but for the sake of completing this little nostalgia trip, I'm going to read and review Woodstock Nation next. That's the book I had gotten mixed up with this one. I've ordered it from the library, from Interlibrary Loan. It will arrive whenever it arrives. I'll read it, and then I'll come back and I'll talk about Woodstock Nation at a future time. But for now, Steal This Book. I've only got 5 minutes left on my camera. My camera automatically, the limit on the video files is 30 minutes. I've wasted most of that time talking about this and that, so let me try and give a quick review of this. Like I said, there's a lot of boring stuff in here. He talks here about food recipes, etc. How to make sandals out of rubber tires. It's just a lot of practical stuff on how to live free or how to live cheap, a lot of it. So it's not the interesting political manifesto that I had thought it was. That's Woodstock Nation. I'll talk about Woodstock Nation another time. The book is mildly interesting for a few reasons. One is there's a lot of little humor snuck in throughout. Again, Abbie Hoffman was a master at political theater and political humor, and there's a lot of little jokes inserted throughout that some of them work better than others, but some of them are quite good. So the book is humorous. The book is also completely out of date. I don't think any of the advice in here is still practical. Okay, maybe some of the cooking advice, making sandals out of tires, that might still be practical. Almost everything else is completely out of date, but in a way, that makes it interesting. So for example, when he talks about how to get free airline tickets, or how to fly for free, he's talking about the airline industry from 50 years ago when their security measures were completely different than they are today. And it's interesting reading that now and thinking, wow, flying sure has changed. Or when he's talking about how to rip off payphones and all the little gimmicks that they used at the time, and completely out of date today. I mean, even if there was a payphone, the whole system has changed. But it's these little insights into a world which is familiar and yet completely different than the modern world we live in. So, if you lived through that era, maybe this book will bring back memories of how payphones and airlines used to operate. If you didn't live through this era, then it's an interesting window into the past. But, yes, as I alluded to before, this book is just a whole lot of ridiculous, immoral advice. Now, according to one of the introductions, there are two introductions in the 50th anniversary edition. Abbie Hoffman apparently said at one point that some of the stuff in the book was deliberately him just being exaggerating, farcical, and some of it was serious and it was the reader's responsibility to sort things out. Which, on the one hand, I guess you can't deny that that's pretty obvious. So like when he's talking about hijacking a plane as a way to fly somewhere free, nobody's taking that seriously, right? Nobody seriously thinks he's advocating for hijacking a plane. On the other hand, it does bring up the question of, well, what's going on here? Is any of the book serious? I mean, he does seem to be serious about ripping off corporations and stores. He's got a whole thing here on shoplifting. I've already talked about my problems with that. But he talks about a lot of things, like, stealing credit card numbers. Now, the stealing credit card numbers is not ripping off some large corporation. That is stealing from another person. And a lot of the things in here, he starts off with the premise that it's okay because you're just sticking it to the man and ripping off the large corporation. But then if you look at a lot of his little schemes and tricks and stuff like that, it's stuff that hurts individual people. Either the people who are working for these corporations and are inconvenienced, or things like when he's talking about ripping off credit card numbers, or stealing credit cards from the hat check room and stuff like that, deliberately stealing from other people. Not to mention the part when he gets into the violence, when he talks about how to, guns and knives and explosives. And now, granted, this was the 1960s when there was an underground revolutionary movement going on, which he references frequently in this book. But, when he talks about the effective way to stab with a knife, you're like, okay, I know, like, in his mind, it's okay because you're stabbing a cop and not a real person. In the mindset, that's not what I think. That's in his mindset. But if you're telling people the most effective way to stab someone with a knife, that's knowledge that they could use for any purpose. They might not stab the people